You're too kind. Appreciate that. All right, afternoon or evening, everybody. How are you all? Good. Well, we're going to talk today about a topic that we've seen covered a lot in the news, and that's redistricting. It has become a very significant political millstone for a lot of politicians. The 2028 election cycle will largely be fought over this issue. The leaders that will emerge from this, the kind of lines that get drawn, and the personalities that result will definitely be something that shapes our whole nation and certainly is going to reshape Texas. So with that, I offer you this unusual title that I'll explain as we go along: Elephant, Peanuts, and Alien Poop. Redistricting, gerrymandering, and how we draw lines that we can sort of live with. So I want to start by talking about some of the reasons that this happens. Every 10 years, the census is taken and the process of redistricting begins. This is the easy story that you have as a, multiple choice question, right, on a test. But as it's supposed to be done, as John Adams wrote in The Birth of the U.S., it's supposed to present these districts, which are small, exact portraits, miniatures really, of the people as a whole. The problem is that the way that this comes about in practical reality is very political. And over the years, there's been political fights that have raised the stakes for how redistricting is seen. This obviously, like I said, has become a very significant political fight happening in Texas, but that has cascaded across the entire country. So we're seeing battles in Texas over redistricting, to the point where you have Democrats and Republicans fighting, and Democrats have broken quorum to leave the state to essentially deny the ability to act legislatively. Threats were made. They're still litigating questions about whether or not some of these members of the legislature will be able to come back and sit, because the Republicans are trying to suggest that they are vacated their seats because they left Austin during the legislative session. The fight is very real. You're seeing it in the halls of the Capitol. You're seeing it fight in places far away as California, Missouri, North Carolina. There is a lot going on, and like I said, a lot at stake. Donald Trump was in part the reason this began. He suggested that there was a need to have more Republican seats across the country. He says in this little clip from the Hill article that he deserves it, that he's earned it. So this is something that obviously started this chain reaction of moments and events where redistricting became a central question that illuminated the entirety of 2025 and will shape what happens in the midterms in 2026. Gavin Newsom responded by saying, simply, it's on, Texas. So California initiated a process where, in order to counteract what Texas was doing to redraw district lines, that they were going to redraw their own district lines. Now, what's unusual about this is that California has an entirely separate way to draw their lines, and they had to undo that. If you were looking at some of the results from the election from 2 days ago, then you probably recognize that California voters voted to approve the new lines that would essentially give the Democrats 5 seats to counteract the 5 supposed Republican seats in Texas. But that is not the end of this story. If you look across the country, like I said, the ripple effects of this discussion about redistricting have and continue to have significant impacts on what states are doing. So here is just a little snapshot of the status of redistricting across the country. Some places like Texas and like Utah and like Missouri are in the process of drawing these lines. North Carolina followed suit not that long ago. Then you have some proposed lines, places like California, places like Florida, New York, Virginia are all considering this. Maryland is the last of these this last week that said that they were considering it. And some are required by courts or by law to do it. So Ohio is in that position. This is a lot of states that are redistricting mid-cycle, mid-decade. This is very, very unusual. And of course, like I said, has strong political implications to what's to come. So can anything stop this? Is there a way to sort of end this process where the states are perpetually changing the district lines. Part of the reason this is important is because it can confuse voters. I live in Houston, and the way the lines have been drawn has been completely jumbled. I refer to it in many cases as an etch-a-sketch. You know, the little kind of line drawing toy? You draw the line and you shake it and then it disappears. This is the way that a lot of district lines look in Houston. So people don't know what district they're in. Here's an even better story. That is that the voters in this, a couple of nights ago, voted for a new member of Congress for the District 18 race. This is a seat that was vacated by Sylvester Turner, who passed away while in office. Eventually, they got this election, and what you find there is that the voters are voting for a temporary replacement for the Congressional District 18 that will then be run in an entirely newly drawn District 18, where about half of the voters in 18 will not be in the new 18th district. So all of this churn means that you've got confused voters, and a confused voter is a non-voter. So how do we fix this? What do we talk about in terms of the way redistricting works? I want to give you a larger perspective of how redistricting functions, the legal considerations over time, and then give you a sense of kind of where we are right now and what we could possibly do about it. This is El Paso in the 60s in a postcard. You can see, obviously, looking at the downtown, that things have changed. I don't have to tell you this. But I want to talk about not just what's changed, but also what's the same. So if you look at some comparisons between what was happening in 1960 and what was happening today, you can see a lot of similarities. You've got increased two-party competition, which is creating a lot of friction. You've got activated racial and ethnic groups who are looking for ways to be able to be politically relevant and try to win. You've also got a rising awareness of the courts of issues like gerrymandering, things like population totals, the minority voting strength, and partisanship are all considerations the courts were giving to redistricting in this period that they're also doing today. So I want to kind of broad map here of the way that we think about these things. Let's start at the beginning. And that's that the Constitution, like I mentioned, requires that we have every 10 years reapportionment. So this is the document, this is the actual language. I highlighted the parts that are the most critical in this score, where reapportionment is supposed to happen at the state level according to the respective numbers every 10 years. This seems easy enough to do, but of course, because we're doing it mid-decade, it has lots of potential consequences and pitfalls. Sam Adlesley, who was a former news reporter for the Dallas Morning News, wrote this great quote in the 1990s after that tumultuous year of redistricting, which of course is always a political fight. He says, "Never before in Texas history have redistricting maps been drawn with so many squiggly lines, figures, and claws than this year's version. It looks like four spiders having an orgy." I'm going to give you some even better, more creative examples of what district lines look like, but the long story short is that an unusually shaped district is probably a legally problematic district. So we're going to explore some of these with some depth and understand what the courts do when it comes to trying to hash out and assess whether or not a district is legal or not. So let's go back in time to the 1950s. There have been a lot of times that Texas has tried to change the way that district lines were drawn to favor incumbents. This is a long-standing practice. It's worth noting that for a long time, the Democrats were in charge. From the Civil War until basically about the 1990s, Democrats ran Texas. And they ran it in much the same way that one-party rule does, where they wanted to protect their interests. So that's exactly what they did in many of these cases. In 1950, in the 1951 round of redistricting, Texas gained one seat because it had enough population increase to merit one. But instead of drawing a new district to accommodate this, they just decided to make the entire state one congressional district. That is one big district. But to do even better than that, in 1960, after the census, Texas gained yet another seat, and because they wanted to keep the districts that the incumbents had as they were, they decided to just draw another full district with just a lot of new people in it. So the population span was huge. Bruce Alger's district, who was the first Republican elected to the U.S. House since Reconstruction at that point, had a district that was almost 1 million people. Now, Wright Prattman's rural district, who was a noted progressive Democrat in this period, had a population district that went to about 200,000 people. So there's a serious size gap there that obviously has impacts in terms of representation. The courts, over time, had been reluctant to get involved in redistricting. Their claim was that these are not justiciable issues. This is a fancy term that basically says that courts can't touch it because it's something that's in the Constitution, as I noted before, that outlines specifically who's supposed to be in charge of this. Well, the finding from Culver versus Green was that in 1946, the court held that they should not enter what they called the political thicket of redistricting. If you wait for just a few years, they change their mind. Sometimes courts do this. In about 20 years, you started to see a different court handle these cases differently. So the Baker versus Carr case is one of the more important ones, where they changed their mind and decide that, in fact, these cases can be considered by the courts. One of the first ones that they did was to undo what Texas did in 1950, which was to say the entire state was one district. In Gray versus Sanders, they decided the unit rule that Texas used to justify this was not constitutional. They followed this up in 1964 with Westbury versus Sanders, where they allow for states to adopt congressional maps that have to be equal in population. So no more districts that have 1 million people and some that have 200,000 people. In Reynolds v. Sims, essentially, they apply the same standards to state legislative districts. So a lot of cases are happening here in the 1960s that dramatically change the way that redistricting is considered. Legally speaking, we see these big changes. We also see some legislative changes that really change the function of how lines are allowed to be drawn. Between 1972 and 2013, it was the case that laws suggested through the Voting Rights Act that any kind of change to election procedures, policies, or methods had to be cleared by the Department of Justice. So Texas was involved in this because it was a southern state and had a history of drawing lines that, according to the courts, were discriminatory. This all changed in 2013. In a holding from the Supreme Court in Shelby County versus Holder, it held that the formula for what determined which jurisdictions, that is southern states, were required to be under this kind of rubric were no longer necessary. Congress had to act, they said, to redo this. Which states really have to be remedied now that we've had the Voting Rights Act in place for almost 40 years? Congress did not act, and so as a result, there isn't additional guidance about how to function here. Now, it's not to say that you can't still have district lines which are unconstitutional by race. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act allows parties to sue mapmakers if they're engaged in discriminatory practices that have the intent or effect of weakening voting rights. I'm going to tell you in a few minutes about how this is in grave jeopardy at the Supreme Court as we speak. So, in a nutshell, Shelby County basically guts the key provisions of the Voting Rights Act that allows for states to have to get pre-approval. So now you can see where states can change lines without having to have oversight from the Department of Justice. Now, again, they can still sue in court because these are constitutional matters, but they no longer have to have the extra step of having DOJ tell them. Do we have to redistrict? Is a question that a lot of people ask. Of course, some of this is political because, like we said, the president has sort of pressed Republican legislatures to make these changes. But in a legal sense, there's no need in every instance to redistrict. You could have the same population, which means you don't need to make changes. If your state doesn't gain any congressional seats or lose any congressional seats, you could keep it the same. This happens for a lot of states over the course of American history. So in a sense, no, you don't have to redistrict. If there's a population change of more than about 3%, the courts have said that requires some numerical balancing. Below that, it's probably not the case that it does. I put little asterisks here because there's a lot of discussion about how fair the census count is. Is the census counting everybody? This is a concern, of course, that's a statistical concern, but also a functional concern when it comes to assessing how many people live in a state. So this is obviously wrapped up in a different, bigger picture, but for sure it's the case that if you know population change is happening beyond 3%, you have to make that change. Another consideration is about what they call the continuity of leadership. This is basically a fancy word of incumbents. If you're an incumbent, there's a reason that mapmakers might protect you, and that's what they call continuity of leadership. So there is a need and there is a respecting of individuals who are in power. So let's talk about when things go haywire, right? And that's what gerrymandering effectively is. Instead of having districts that are drawn to represent little micro USs, you have essentially a situation where you've got politicians who are picking voters. That's the real conundrum that a lot of states face with respect to how to draw district lines. Now, I'll give you some sense in the next few minutes about the way courts handle this and what they see in terms of the quality and ability for the states to do it this way, but suffice it to say that there are a lot of rules that courts are putting onto states in terms of what is and is not permissible. So gerrymandering itself is a very old concept. It actually comes from a moment in the early 1800s when the governor of Massachusetts, in this case Elbridge Gerry, decided that he was going to create this very unusual district, and it became part of lore. So the name is really a mashup of two things: Gerry, his name, and a salamander, which is what it looked like. You may have seen this political cartoon before. It's a pretty clever representation of how the district lines looked. So we're used to seeing these unusual lines, and as I said, an unusually shaped district is often a problematic district. So districting with respect to race is a complicated arrangement. The courts have over time held that there are some very strict rules about the way this might function. So for instance, in a case in 1971, White versus Register, they argued that a multi-member district, which is this mega-sized district outside San Antonio, was unconstitutional because it diluted racial voting strength. The follow-up to this was a couple of years later in Alonzo versus Jones, where it ruled that at-large election systems in Corpus Christi violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Taken together, what it says is this: if you have a huge area where you're electing people from a giant regional population, it's most important to cut those into smaller districts. You can't have it as one big glut. And this is actually a case that continues today. The school district that I live in, where my kids had gone and go to school, is fighting this very battle. There is a question about whether or not you can draw a school district line with the entire district, or you have to have certain sub-districts. So this is a fight that continues even today. But at this point, the courts have basically said that at-large systems tend to be unconstitutional. The one I highlight here is important, and I wanted to call attention to it. This is the case of Shaw versus Reno, a linchpin for how it is that we understand the role of race in redistricting. What the court held here was that a majority-minority district is not unconstitutional, but race cannot be the sole factor in drawing congressional districts. What this does is open the door to the question about how race can and cannot be used in this matter. This was followed up by Miller versus Johnson in '95, where the court holds that districts with bizarre shapes suggest that there's some kind of violation. This is what I've been saying anecdotally. That is, if the district looks weird, it's probably problematic. So rebalancing is necessary. If you've got a district that has a large population, that's a very diverse population, there's a need to draw district lines that meet many of these standards. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 specifies that numerical balance cannot fragment, dilute, or unfairly compact the minority population's voting strength to restrict their ability to win elections. So, to put this in a nutshell, then that last point's the one to focus on. There can be no cracking, packing, or stacking. Let me define these a little bit more clearly because they give us a pretty clear visual sense of how map makers are hemmed in by these kinds of choices, legal choices. Cracking is defined as splitting groups of what we call disfavored voters among multiple districts. If you're trying to draw lines that basically limit the ability for one group to win, you want to crack them into various districts. So here you see in the visual pretty clearly, you've got sort of a group of people that you split into various districts so that you can dilute the power of the electorate. Another way to do this is what we call cracking. Cracking is a similar process, but it reverses the process, where you've got essentially putting a bunch of people into a district that their voting strength is diluted. So you draw it in such a way as to dilute the strength of that particular group. This is called packing. In both cases, like I said, these are unconstitutional dynamics. Now, there are a lot of things that are part of this, that go into this, but at its core, these are the most critical elements. Let's shift to talk about Texas, because as you can imagine, Texas is the political center of the universe in so many things. Redistricting today, redistricting yesterday. Here is a case from the 2010 census. Yes, 2010 census, then called Abbott versus Perez. This was argued about 10 years after the redistricting cycle happened. This was a case that questioned that the mapmakers' lines under racial questions. That is, that the Texas legislature had drawn lines that were unfair and potentially harmed Black and Hispanic residents and their voting powers. Throughout the litigation, at every level of the court's handling of this, lower courts made 10 different findings of intentional discrimination against the state of Texas. These are both Democratic and Republican elected or appointed judges. The court ends up looking at these districts for a long time. Like I said, it takes them about a decade to fully litigate these maps. This doesn't hold, I think, bode well for our current litigation, which is litigating not just one, but two sets of maps here in El Paso. I'm sure you've seen coverage of this. So there is a long-standing process when it comes to how to understand these districts and how complex they might be. So what did the court do? In a 5-4 vote, the U.S. Supreme Court determined that one of the districts in question, in fact, was drawn with the intentional act of discriminating against Latinos in North Texas, in Tarrant County. So the case was remanded back to the district court, who said you have to work with the legislature to redraw these lines. Eventually they did that, and they argue the problem was solved. So what this tells us is that it's really difficult to put basically any state back under the pre-clearance procedure. If Texas had been found to intentionally discriminate in a variety of ways, then they would have been back under the cover of the Department of Justice oversight. But because they didn't, in this case, except for that one district, the likelihood of any state, including Texas, to be back under that coverage umbrella is very, very low. So essentially it means that the legislature can do almost whatever they want. If you compare that and connect that to the way that the courts have recently handled issues about redistricting, then you can see that the mapmakers have basically a free hand to do almost anything they want. Here's a little clip from the NBC News that says that basically the Supreme Court has allowed for the unfettered power of states to rebrand and redistrict in almost any time in any way that they want. Now, of course, race is still a factor, although that may be going away. It is, though, the case now that mapmakers have a lot of authority to draw these maps based upon partisanship. So I want to address this in two phases. The first is the wind-up, and then the pitch. So in terms of the wind-up, partisan gerrymandering has always been a question for the courts. For a long time, they punted. They didn't address it. They didn't want to deal with it because it's too hard to figure out whether a line was drawn for district reasons that were partisan or that were race. So they didn't address it. But little by little, the courts gave us a tease about what to expect and how they were thinking. So let's go back to the 80s. In 1983, in Karcher versus Daggett, the court held that even if districts were designed to maximize one party in a certain district, they still had to meet other burdens, like, for instance, population equality. In the 90s, in Hunt versus Comentary, the court ruled basically that the districts are drawn on the basis of partisanship, but also create a majority-minority district are not unconstitutional. So you see the slow seeping of the ability for mapmakers to draw lines based upon partisanship creep into the jurisprudence. In Lulac versus Perry in 2006, partisan gerrymandering was determined to be a judicial concern, but they didn't set a standard for what that looked like. All they did was say that you cannot necessarily use partisanship, but if you do, we can handle it. We can take the case. So it opens the door for the courts to consider partisanship in gerrymandering in the future. Here's the pitch. In Common Cause versus Rucho versus Common Cause in 2019, the court essentially allowed for redistricting to include partisanship. The court held in 5-4 decision that federal courts cannot decide whether maps were drawn specifically to tilt party power in favor of one party or the other. Chief Justice Roberts, who joined the majority on this and wrote the decision, said that in order for justices to evaluate claims of partisan gerrymandering, they'd need to have a, quote, limited and precise standard for what that would be. Clear, manageable, and politically neutral. But the problem is that nobody stepped up to make that determination. So what the courts essentially did was open the door for map makers to use partisanship under any standard they wished. And the standard they wish, in most cases, especially for those drawing partisan lines, is that they wanted to draw it to protect their partisan incumbents and maybe even expand the opportunities for their party to win. It's perfectly natural, right? Parties have done this forever, but now they've got a green light from the Supreme Court to make that happen. So the decision essentially sweeps aside the idea that federal courts could rein in what states did with respect to the party in power. So again, writing for the majority, the Chief Justice simply said that federal courts could not intervene on this issue because they don't know what the standard is. How can you determine, he asked, what gerrymandering looks like with respect to partisanship? So there is this sort of storyline here where with the technological advances making it easier to draw these kinds of districts, then now map makers can do almost any creative thing that they can to create a district that maximizes their partisan strength. That's exactly what is happening in Texas. That's exactly what's happening in California. All the states, like I showed you earlier, that are trying this are now doing exactly this because the courts effectively let them. If you look at the population changes in Texas from 2010 to 2020, you can certainly see some of the growth happening among the Latino community in particular. That is definitely something that map makers are considering. And when it comes to drawing these maps, they're very cognizant of how race and partisanship interact. So now you get these crazy looking districts that refers to the title of my talk, where there are a lot of different ways to interpret what these look like. Let's see if you can pick some of these out. Okay, here's one. This is Congressional District 10 that stretches from Austin basically to Houston. This, they say, looks like an elephant eating a peanut. Do you see it? It's like looking at a cloud, right? Like people see a hot dog or they see a, tilt-a-whirl. Like there's like a lot of stuff you can read into it. If you look at it carefully, maybe you'll get it. Here's another one. I don't know if I see this one. This is the district that I live in, the District 7 in Houston. It looks like an extraterrestrial taking a poop. I don't know. Maybe if I had a laser pointer. Do I have a laser pointer? No, I don't. There's like a head at the top, maybe leaning down to the body. Not sure. Here's one, the Thinker. You all know what this looks like, right? The famous Rodin kind of picture where he's resting his chin on his knuckles. Sort of. This is the new 36th Congressional District, which is the kind of Bay Area in and around Houston. I sort of see it a little bit. Here's one, Abraham Lincoln's head on a sea monster. I don't know about this. You can sort of see Abe Lincoln's head up by, what is that? Oh, that's Lake Houston. You can kind of see the head around there, maybe the furrowed brow of Abraham Lincoln, not sure. Well, in any case, like I mentioned, there's a lot of creativity that goes into these districts, and there's a lot of implications to the way these district lines get drawn. So a couple things are worth noting here. Number one, the census definitely counts. Where people live and the growth of certain populations matter a lot in terms of making these choices. What's also important to note is that a lot of these district lines will not be finalized until very close, if not even after the filing deadline. So November, I think 18th is the filing deadline. If you're going to run for office, for a federal state office, that is the day by which you have to do it. The problem is you don't know if the courts are going to certify the district lines that got drawn because they're still being litigated in court. So the courts are really hustling to try to get to this date. It's possible they might push the primary off. So we're supposed to have a primary in March. It might not be till May until they can figure out, legally speaking, if these districts are legitimate or not. The court is watching for sure, right? They may not be looking at this with sympathetic eyes, but they're definitely looking at the specific elements of what constitutes a legitimate constitutional district. And finally, partisan line drawing is okay, but the standards may change. One of the ways the standards may change is that you're seeing the court literally today deal with issues about partisan and racial gerrymandering out of a case from Louisiana. So I want to talk about that in a second, but I also want to frame this in a bigger conclusion. And that's about the solutions to this issue. Like I asked earlier, are we just destined to have perpetual redistricting where every 2 years we're seeing new lines being drawn all across the country? That's a recipe for chaos. And I don't think we'll have that exactly, but it's definitely the case that we're going to see more and more redistricting happen. So what do voters want? All the survey evidence of this suggests the voters are interested in the following kinds of things. I'm sure some of these hit home for you too. To be basically a fair map, voters want to have a fair election. They want to have a system where not one party or the other is automatically going to win. They want to have representation among distinct constituencies. That is, they want to have a diverse Congress that represents people. They want competitive districts. They want compact districts that represent neighborhoods. The districts that span from one big city to another big city in a place like Texas are amazingly huge and challenging to govern, and a difficult moment for representatives to be able to represent, right? This is the concern from a lot of people who look at the current maps in Texas and say, look, you've got districts that span a tremendous amount of rural space that then stretch into an urban environment. The rural representation is very different from an urban representation. So it's a challenge to find this equilibrium for members of Congress. People also want to make election administration easier, to keep these districts compact in a careful way. Accomplishing all these things, obviously, is really challenging, right? This is something that's hard for us to deliver to voters because of the way that the process goes. The ultimate conclusion here from a lot of this, as you're probably sensing, is that the court is unlikely to help. Like I said, there's a current case that the court is considering with respect to a case out of Louisiana. Now, it's a little technical here, but basically what's going on is that the court has asked the plaintiff's attorneys for additional briefings on some specifics with respect to how race was used in this process. This, at least for court watchers, is an indication that the court is going to overturn the Voting Rights Act, at least this section of the Voting Rights Act. So for instance, in this case, Louisiana has a 1/3 black population, but after the 2020 census, the state legislature drew lines that resulted in only one district where black voters were likely to have the chance to elect a candidate of their choice. So Louisiana had to create a second majority district to comply with the Voting Rights Act, and then you had people sue saying this is unconstitutional. So that's the fight. Can Louisiana draw these lines in a way that reflects race or not? The court seems to be asking, without at least directly saying it, that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, like I mentioned earlier, is probably destined to fail. That is, they're going to say that it's no longer relevant, no longer necessary. This is a little small here, but this is a clip from the New York Times from a couple of weeks ago where it outlines some of the questions that the justices were asking the lawyers with the expectation from court watchers that basically the court was willing to overturn the Voting Rights Act. So there's a very good chance this could happen. If it happens, then the likelihood of every other state redistricting, or in the case, say, of Texas, to redistrict is very, very high, because now there are very few guardrails in terms of how you draw these district lines. Now, like I said, the courts probably won't do much here. They've been moving into a slightly different direction in terms of allowing for state legislatures to draw lines as they wish, but there are other options. Congress could step in. In 2022, Congress passed the Freedom to Vote Act, which was a landmark piece of legislation that would prohibit mid-decade redistricting. That's what this fight is about. However, the bill didn't pass the Senate, so it's still lingering. A couple of weeks ago, Representative Don Davis from North Carolina, by the way, whose district has been redrawn in this last round of gerrymandering, filed a bill to try to institute a retroactive and proactive ban on mid-decade redistricting, very similar to the case and legislation I just mentioned to you. Also probably not likely to pass. So Congress is probably not the avenue to make this happen. State legislatures can change the way they draw district lines. Some have. 18 states have given the power to draw district maps to either a nonpartisan or a bipartisan commission, and this has been something the Supreme Court has upheld. It's a little small to see, so apologies for that, but you can definitely get a sense of across the states, there's a lot of variation in the way this happens. Most states, like those red states there, tend to be ones that let the legislature draw lines, but a handful increasingly, including California, which had to undo that decision with the majority vote among its voters, draw these based upon district lines. So there is some variation here in how this functions, and that's one opportunity and one path to make redistricting a little more fair. What I should also note is that scholarship suggests that when you have a bipartisan or nonpartisan commission drawing lines, those lines tend to be more fair in terms of the political outcomes than the ones drawn by legislatures. So it does work to have it this way. If you look at the way that this breaks down, you can see kind of how it ends up in the situation we're in now. About 41% of all district lines are drawn in a way that are done by legislatures run by the Republicans. About 11% of districts are drawn in places where Democrats have a majority. So you can definitely see why it is Republicans nationwide, federal Republicans are happy to make these lines redrawn. They can pressure state legislatures to make these changes, and if they do, then they're probably going to get a better deal out of it. A very small percentage, about 19%, have an independent commission. Sometimes you have the courts do it, because they're remedying past discriminatory issues, and sometimes there's a political commission that does it. So again, there's a lot of variety here, and you can definitely see the path that we're on today caused by the way that these lines are allowed to be drawn. So at the end of the day, like I've said, I've tried to give you a flavor for the way that this operates. The stakes are extremely high. The courts have given a lot of guidance in terms of how this operates and continue to do so, but we'll see a lot of changes happen. So watch the Supreme Court to see what they do on this Louisiana case. Watch these other states to see how they redistrict, or if they reject redistricting, as some states have. There's a lot of ways that this is going to influence very directly what happens in 2026, which will have a significant impact on then what happens in 2028 and into the future. So I'll stop there and love to answer questions if you all have any. Oh, yeah, thanks. Thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Rottinghaus,
yes.
I have a mic here,
and perfect.
James is over here, my colleague. So
awesome.
Anybody interested in asking questions, let us know. Yeah, you have it. Okay, yes. Go ahead. I don't bring my glasses.
Don't be shy. We're all friends.
Anybody has questions?
I have a question as far as voter presence. What is the process of transparency when it comes to the redistricting and the process?
Yeah, it's a great question. The question is, I think framed in the idea of what voters want, and there's a lot of opportunities to participate normally in the ways that map makers draw lines. They have hearings often, and that's one way you can go converse. You can send your comments to the committees that often redraw these lines. I will say, though, that we've gotten maybe too far away from that. When Texas redid its lines, it didn't have significant hearings. There were some across different parts of the state, but they had limited abilities. The same is true for California. They didn't have a lot of input in terms of what those lines look like. Now, California voters got to decide if they were going to redo those lines, but that was only kind of after it was all said and done. So there are opportunities for the public to weigh in on this, but we don't have as many of those things. So I think that it's just like any other policy issue. Talking to your elected officials about the things that you care about, organizing locally to press the issues that you care about to make sure that your communities are heard, I think is a good recipe for how it is you can involve yourself in what map makers do. Now, there are, of course, some states that have map drawing that is independent, and so they, on purpose, kind of don't accept people's opinions. They have kind of their own fact-finding. And like I said, that's generally speaking makes more fair maps, but there are lots of ways like that that we can at least have some input beyond and have that as a good way for us to make our voices heard, and a process that's extremely important for how representation functions. Yeah, great question.
Anyone? It's over there.
What's your opinion on the lack of term limits in Texas elected offices?
Yeah, good question. Term limits are tricky because a lot of scholarship suggests that all term limits do is to increase partisanship. The way it works is the following. Basically, you have someone in office who might learn the system and may come in as a partisan but will moderate a little bit. You see this a lot in the Texas legislature. Now, if you replace those people by law with a limit, then the new people who come in are always going to be more partisan, right? More liberal, more conservative, right? That's the nature of how elections go. It's kind of this slippery slope. So I'm a little ambivalent on term limits with respect to how it affects partisanship. I also like the idea of having people who know what they're doing stay in office for longer. Now, maybe the term limit should be present but long term, right? 10 years, 15 years. It takes a long time in Congress to get seniority enough to be impactful, so people want to get elected when they're young and then stay around till they're old. So that's at least some impetus for people to stick around. So I guess it's a wishy-washy answer to your question. My personal opinion is that term limits do as much harm as good, but it does solve some problems in terms of trying to have more of a churn. One dramatic issue with respect to people being in office for a long time is that you tend to see increased corruption, not sometimes intentional, but it does corrode your ability to really understand people. You stop paying attention to kind of new trends. You kind of focus on the things you already know. So that has a real liability too. So I'm kind of on the fence, but there is scholarship that suggests that it's probably not a net gain in terms of either experience or solving partisanship. So sort of, yeah, unclear, I think, at this point. It's a tough call. Some states do have partisanship, and that's how we know, because we can study that dynamic. But yeah, like you say, in Texas, there's none, and for federal elections, there's none. The last thing I'll say on this is that voters are a great check, right, on these issues. So if you think someone's not attentive, if you think that they're out of step, you think they're not doing the right thing, we can vote them out. It's a challenge in some cases, but that's the ultimate check, right, the public. Yeah, good question.
There was another question on that side, over there. Yeah.
Hello, thank you. Yes, it was a very wonderful talk. Thank you very much for coming here, and a wonderful presentation. So, as you discussed earlier, a major consequence of gerrymandering is perhaps the disenfranchisement or disillusionment of voters. Yeah. So I want to ask you, what's your opinion on whether or not a world can manifest where legislation takes place to perhaps rein in gerrymandering? Because what happens when the public can no longer be a check because gerrymandering has grown out of control? How can voters keep these keep the people in power in check if the districts have been drawn specifically against them without any safety rails from the courts, which are supposed to be the check on elected representatives?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the best route is probably the legislative route at the congressional level. They're the ones who can set the standard for what constitutes a legitimate gerrymandering or legitimate redistricting. So I'm in favor of that. That's the easiest global solution. Short of that, I think what you'll see now is more states who have initiative and referendum adding this to their to-do list. So you'll have more states trying to ask the public to convert from legislative drawn lines to having a nonpartisan or bipartisan commission. Those are the two most likely paths, I think, that include the public in some indirect way, but that definitely are ways to solve this in a more structural way. Trying to get legislators who have a strong incentive to maintain partisanship and protect their incumbents on their own do this is probably not likely, right? Having them slow this process is probably like a pipe dream. So I think the best way to do it is to have that. You're also seeing, like I said, the courts probably not offering the kind of guardrails that we are used to seeing. So the legislative route is probably the most likely, but that's not going to solve every problem. It'll still be this conundrum. Beyond that, I am not sure. It's a really good question, right? You could have states where people are so unhappy that they continuously push back and say you have to stop redistricting. It's just an insane thing to keep doing. It's too confusing for voters and just creates this kind of political churn. So I'm hopeful that cooler heads will prevail on this. I'll say this in general too, and that's that elites got us into this partisan world and elites are going to get us out. We have to find people who are willing to do the right thing and to try to make the balance more fair. I don't know exactly how that happens, except just that we have to kind of request that, we have to demand that, but that's probably the kind of end result of a lot of this, and that's a tough thing to get. So it's still a long ways off, I think, and we're gonna have to kind of hold our breath a little collectively as how this goes, as it goes on, but I do think that there are opportunities to slow and stop this process from happening forever and ever. Yeah, it's a great question though. That is really the question about like all of this.
How does redistricting affect communities with large populations of undocumented immigrants who, for fear of deportation, are not counted in the census?
Yeah, that's a great question, yeah. That's why I mentioned that the census really counts, right? It really matters because how you count people and where you count them living is important. The same is true for people who are incarcerated. The way that they count them is in the place that they're incarcerated, not where they live. In some states, they can vote. In fact, people in jail can vote, although most municipalities, most counties don't let that happen. So there are a lot of concerns about how people are represented who otherwise aren't easy to count. And so this is something that the states have really grappled with. There is an effort to try to make the census more statistically minded so that you can estimate populations. This has been litigated and generally speaking has been frowned upon. So it's harder to find a kind of realistic way to be careful about counting people who otherwise are very hard to count. So it's still, I think, set in the 1800s, the way we count. And that probably is not going to change because the litigation hasn't allowed it, and I don't think the politics are going to change on that much either. So it's one battle at a time for now, I think, and Democrats are in particular trying to fight to see if they can hold the line as best as possible. So it's not a great answer to your question except to say that there really isn't a good solution right now that I've seen other than the kind of statistically driven approach, which has also been ruled kind of legally problematic. So we'll have to wait and see how they shake it all out. But that's a fight for like a different scenario. Yeah, but a good one, really important one.
Do you think there should be more requirements in order to redistrict than just, you know, the 3% population increase? And if so, what are they?
Yeah, great point. Like, what should we use as a standard, right? That's a really great point. I don't know if there's a, like, logistical, legal standard that one could use for this, but over time, like I said, there are different sort of population requirements that are the most pressing in terms of those balance. So that seems to me to be a pretty good trigger. You know, as long as you're drawing the maps fairly to kind of begin with, it hopefully is creating momentum towards, you know, an effort to make things fair. So I don't know if I can consider any other criteria other than just not doing things that could be legally problematic. I think you do have to give map makers some flexibility because these are really hard to do. If you ever played around with software that will let you kind of do this, it's a challenge to draw a district that does all the things that you want it to do and doesn't do the things that are illegal. So some flexibility is important, but it is really a challenge to draw these district lines. So I don't know if I have any criteria in mind per se, except that we need to like focus on voters and what they want. And if I think that, I mean, Texas is a great example. Our turnout is so low, terribly low. And I think part of the reason, of course, is it's a one-party state, but we also have a tremendous amount of apathy, in part because of this partisan divide. So I think if you could change those things, you'd have more voters. Those voters would have better opinions, and then that would theoretically kind of trickle up to change some of those ideas. So I'm hopeful that can happen, but it's a long shot right now. I think we're not in a place where politically we can make that happen until we start to see those guardrails kind of get put back into place. The other thing to note is that, I didn't talk about this much, but state legislatures can also be checked by state courts. And so there are a lot of states that are pushing back on redistricting, saying you can't do it. This actually kind of is a conundrum that Indiana faced, where they were going to redistrict and in a certain way, but they were kind of restrained by the courts. So it's possible that you see a different judicial level put some guardrails on this, even if like the federal judicial won't. So it's a great question, and I think needed to make this very clear. But I think if we're trying to follow the wishes of the voters, then we're always in good shape.
Hi, Doctor. My name is Tristan Williams. It's nice to meet you. I have a question in regards to the counting of illegal immigrants in the census in regards to districting. Should we continue to do so, and why?
As it is now, they don't. That is, if you're not documented and you're not a citizen, then they don't count you, and so you're basically not part of that. So as a result, there's a lot of lack of representation there, right? And I think that's one kind of conundrum that a lot of places like Texas face. So it is a concern, and gets to this very question about the way that representation functions vis-a-vis people. So yeah, it's a crisis, and especially in places like border Texas makes a big issue. But even increasingly urban Texas, it's a different kind of issue too. Yeah, sure.
So if I were to go on Google, like right now, like I Googled it before I asked the question, if they're counted in the census when it comes to redistricting, it says yes.
Yeah.
So why did you say it's not?
I don't think that it is. I'd love to talk more about it, but as far as I know, I don't think they're counting them in the census because you're not a citizen. You're not allowed. You're not counting you in like the way that the district line includes like the voting age population.
Well, they just include persons, not necessarily the people in there. They don't check citizenship when they're doing the census. They just check to see how many people live in a district, which allows the people living in the district to then count towards representation, which then disenfranchises constituents.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, yeah. So they're also looking at like the voter age population, which is another factor that they're considering when it comes to like how they draw those lines. That's something that Texas has been doing this last cycle to try to figure out how to craft these things in ways that allow for the populations to be equal. So yeah, it is a crisis. I don't know definitively if that's happening or not. I'd love to know more about what that means. But as far as I know, this is something that they may count as a person, but they're not counting you as a voter. And those are the two considerations that they really care about. So that's an interesting point. And creates a lot of sort of difficulties to make representation function. And that's at the core of it what this is sort of all about. So yeah, good point.
So,
Apologies, I have a follow-up question regarding bringing up voter turnout.
Yeah.
Because as we know, there was a special election here for Texas for the 17 proposed constitutional amendments to Texas. And I wanted to ask you, is there a world where in the same way House bills and Senate bills die due to not reaching that threshold of votes required, is there a world where legislation can come in and say, this state did not have enough voter representation to legitimize this bill? Like, it's not accurate to put the go-ahead or the green light on this bill because we didn't get enough people for it.
Interesting. The answer is no, it's not, right? Like, all it requires is a majority support for it. It's an interesting question, though, right? Like, if you could get a threshold amount of support in order for that to be successful. I've done work on recall elections in Texas, and one of the things there that they require is like a certain threshold of voters to be able to like initiate a recall. So there are times where you see that as a solution, but it's not in this case something that they look at. It's intriguing though. You'd like to see more voter participation, and maybe requiring it to happen among these sort of times would be useful. So I wonder, I don't know of any state that does it that way, but I'd be pretty interested in finding out. But Texas does not, so at least as it is now, even despite low turnout, it's still pretty, they're all pass. I will say that, you know, Texas's turnout is troublesome on these, but this last cycle wasn't awful. It wasn't as bad as it has been in past cycles. So maybe we're seeing kind of people more attentive to these issues. There were a lot of things on the constitutional proposed amendment that got passed that were really important, like lots of money spent on water and dementia research, tax breaks. So there's a lot of stuff at stake. So you'd think people would be more engaged, and they kind of were, but still pretty low all overall, yeah.
So, Doctor, I think gerrymandering is one effect of polarization that you're a specialist in. And I heard many students that they're frustrated because neither of the parties represent them really, and they're given very little choices. And then we're trapped in this world where parties gerrymander each other to death, and then they fight, they cannot pass budgets, they cannot pass legislation, they undermine Voting Rights Act, they undermine even our civil liberties, right? And then so is there, I tell my students then don't give up. What would you recommend to break this like dark bubble of partisanship and division, right?
Yeah. It's a really good question and a tough issue to resolve. Obviously, it's a two-party system, and so it's challenging to find ways to be able to break that. I do think one way to do it is to focus on local processes, local elections. That's something often that's not partisan, and so you can definitely get a better traction and policy when you're not dealing with strictly kind of partisan issues. So that's one thing that you could do. I think another thing is just, I think the more that people are involved in these processes, the more that they demand these kinds of policy changes, the more you're going to see this. So for instance, if you look at this last election, there are people who were elected in New York who couldn't get elected in Virginia, people who were elected in Texas who couldn't get elected in North Carolina. So the version of the representation that's diverse and because of those demands that gets, I think, spread out is good, right? That gives us a sense that politicians are responding to regional/local concerns, and that's a good thing. So I'm hopeful that maybe that's a way to break that hold, where you're gonna still see red and blue, right? You know, liberals and conservatives, but there's lots of flavors of that. And so it's worth fighting for the people that you like and that you trust and care about. That's definitely like a way to solve a lot of the issues that I think partisanship tends to confront. The people who are arch conservatives and arch liberals, you may not like them, but they have to be kind of part of the system. It's just the way things are. But there are opportunities for us, I think, as voters to demand those kinds of changes. But it's a good question, and I don't have a great answer in terms of solving it. I wish that I did.
See, thank you so much, Doctor, for your talk. Let's give an applause. So.